Hi, welcome to part 2 of the respiratory system. I have switched back to hosting things on YouTube. I think this way of recording works a little bit better for me. I don't know if you're going to like it better or not. But this is how the screencasts used to be. So we're picking up in the respiratory system, and we are talking about Dalton's Law of Partial Pressure. Here we are. So I don't care that you know Dalton's name, and I don't care that you can explain the law. What it says is that total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is the sum of the pressures exerted by each gas, and that the partial pressure of each gas is directly proportional to its percentage in the mixture. This also applies to when it's dissolved in a liquid like your bloodstream. So for example, let's say you had a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen for scuba diving, and it was at 100 psi in your scuba tank. If it was a 50% mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, then the partial pressure due to oxygen in the tank would be 50 psi, and the partial pressure due to nitrogen in the tank would be 50 psi. So the pressure for us is the same thing as concentration. So you can just, in your mind, copy and paste everything you know about concentration onto pressure. And for the rest of this chapter, whenever we're talking about respiratory gases, instead of talking about the concentration of CO2 in your bloodstream or the concentration of oxygen, we will simply talk about the partial pressure due to oxygen or the partial pressure due to CO2. All right, Henry, this is another person whose name we don't care about, but what Henry's law basically says to us is that when two liquids come into contact with each other, like air and your bloodstream, gases are going to diffuse from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So again, pressure equals concentration, and gases diffuse into and out of your bloodstream according to their partial pressure gradient, just like solutes in solutions diffuse into or out of your cells according to their concentration gradients. I have to speak carefully. Okay, so we are going to have two different kinds of gas exchange or respiration, or two different places where it happens in your body. When you are exchanging gases between the air and your blood in your lungs, this is called external respiration. And when gas exchange is taking between your bloodstream and your tissues, like a muscle, this is called internal respiration. So when we talk about these two processes, we want to understand two things. One is, which way is each gas going to go? And two, what are the partial pressure gradients, or where is the partial pressure of each gas higher or lower? If you simply think about what needs to happen in your lungs and what needs to happen in your tissues, then you should be able to intuit which way the gases are going to diffuse, and then you just make the partial pressure gradients match the movement of the gases based on what you know about diffusion. So looking here first at external respiration, this is the exchange of gases between your bloodstream and the air in your alveolus. So if you just think about the way your body works, your cells are going to produce CO2, so you want to exhale CO2. So CO2 is always going to be moving from the bloodstream into the alveolus. If you recall that gases move according to their partial pressure gradients the same way solutes move according to concentration gradients, then it's not too big of a stretch to remember that the partial pressure due to CO2 in the blood in your lungs is going to be higher than the partial pressure due to CO2 in the air in your lungs. That is what allows CO2 to diffuse out of your bloodstream and into the air in your lungs. Conversely, oxygen, right? We know we need oxygen to survive. So when we breathe, it's going to go into our bloodstream. So if the oxygen is traveling down its partial pressure gradient, the same way a solute would, then you're going to have high partial pressure due to oxygen in the air and low partial pressure due to oxygen in your bloodstream. And I did forget to point out, every time you see that P there, that refers to partial pressure. So PCO2 is partial pressure due to CO2. PO2 is partial pressure due to oxygen. Another way to think about it is that gases get blown from one place to another, just like wind blows. And so you're going to have high pressure on one end to blow the gas into the other end. So you're always pushing gases with high pressure into the compartments where you want them to be. That doesn't necessarily mean that the pressure is always going to get, or ever going to get high where you want the gas to be. It is high where the gas originates so that it gets to where you want it to be. Then internal respiration, same concept, only everything is now switched, right? So now you're talking about the exchange of gases between your bloodstream and a tissue, or more specifically the interstitial fluid in your tissues. Now we know that our cells require oxygen. This is why we need it to survive. So oxygen is going to move from the bloodstream into the tissues. This hopefully just intuitively makes sense. And then, if you recall, things have to move down their partial pressure gradient. When you're comparing the partial pressure due to oxygen in your bloodstream versus your tissues that need it, it's higher in your bloodstream so that it will diffuse into your tissues. And then CO2, just the opposite. It is created by your tissues, so it is always going to be high in the tissue and then will diffuse into your bloodstream. So just keep those two situations straight, internal respiration and external respiration. You're going to see there's a lot of potentially confusing concepts in the chapter, but it all makes sense if you stop and think about how you want your body to work. Then we have this process or phenomenon called ventilation-perfusion coupling. We should first define our terms. So ventilation simply means airflow. This is how much air is moving through a bronchiole or into individual alveoli. Perfusion refers to how much blood is flowing through the capillaries. And now we want to remember, right, this blue arrow here, that's the blood flowing into the capillaries. We're used to it being red, but this is our pulmonary circulation, so it's our deoxygenated blood, and this blue arteriole that is carrying the blood into this capillary bed where it's going to receive oxygen. So what you want your body to do is have lots of blood in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli that have lots of air in them. And if for some reason one of your alveoli or one of your alveolar sacs here isn't well ventilated, there's no point in sending a lot of blood to that part of the lungs. So what you're doing is matching blood flow to oxygen availability, or matching your perfusion to your ventilation. And what your body uses is oxygen to sense the ventilation, and then adjusts the blood flow by causing vasodilation or vasoconstriction in the arteriole feeding that capillary bed. So in the first instance here, we have a fair amount of blood, or lots of blood and little air. So there's a mismatch in our ventilation and perfusion ratio, if you will. that means that there is decreased partial pressure due to oxygen in this blood here. So somewhere in this blood vessel is a receptor that can sense how much oxygen is there, or the partial pressure due to oxygen. And if it is sensing that there's low oxygen availability here, less ventilation, then it is going to cause vasoconstriction of the arteriole. So you start with lots of blood flow into this capillary, but because there's less oxygen there, you get vasoconstriction, and then there's less blood flow into the capillary surrounding that poorly ventilated alveolus. Here we have the same picture. Sorry, I don't have inflated and deflated alveoli, but this is just the opposite situation that you need to imagine. Now this alveolus is very well ventilated, so there's lots of air flowing into it, but not a lot of blood flowing into our arteriole. So this means that there's going to be a high partial pressure due to oxygen in this arteriole, or in the alveolus. This will be sensed by the body, and then you're going to get vasodilation of this arteriole. So more blood flows into the well-ventilated capillary to match ventilation and perfusion. So low PO2, vasoconstriction; high PO2, vasodilation. That's what it boils down to, and what you want to remember. Okay, so the first thing you want to remember about oxygen transport is that it is bound by hemoglobin. So 98.5% of it is carried by hemoglobin. Only a very small percentage of the oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. However, that part, I should say, is rather simple. What is a little bit complicated is the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And let me just get my laser pointer back. I like it a little better. There we go. Actually, I'm going to need the pen in a second. Affinity means stickiness, as it says here. So how tightly is the hemoglobin holding on to oxygen? What you want to remember is that the hemoglobin is inside of your red blood cells, and your red blood cells stay in the blood vessels. So here's a blood vessel. Yay, I can draw. And there's your red blood cells. They stay in here. If you want oxygen to get here, then the oxygen is going to have to detach from the hemoglobin and diffuse into the tissue. So what this means for us is that if you increase the affinity, that means the oxygen is going to stay in the red blood cell and not make it into the tissue. So that actually decreases the delivery. If you decrease the affinity, that increases the delivery. Right? So over here, if you're decreasing the affinity, then oxygen goes this way. So what we want to see is decreased affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen as the blood is traveling through the tissues that need more oxygen. So these three factors right here, partial pressure due to oxygen, temperature, and pH, all affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And before we see any scary looking graphs, we want to sort of intuitively understand why the relationship is the way it is, and wrap our minds around the things that should be or could be intuitive if we just relaxed and think about them. So if you have a highly metabolic tissue, then that is a tissue that requires lots of oxygen. So the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen is such that the delivery of oxygen is increased in highly metabolic tissues. That means there is going to be low affinity in the highly metabolic tissues. So then if you just think about how partial pressure due to oxygen, temperature, and pH would be altered in highly metabolic tissues, then it's easier to remember how the affinity is going to be affected by changes in those parameters. So think about a muscle that is highly active. So you're on a bike, you're riding uphill, your quadriceps are working a lot harder than your biceps. So the partial pressure due to oxygen in your quadriceps is going to be, right, it should be lower, right? You want more oxygen in your quadriceps, but they're using it, so the partial pressure due to oxygen is always going to be low in a tissue that's using lots of oxygen, right? Think about temperature. You're probably going to start sweating as you're climbing up that hill because heat is a byproduct of metabolism. So those tissues that are more highly metabolic are going to have higher temperature. How then do you think metabolism might affect pH? Should the pH in a highly metabolic tissue be higher or lower? And keep in mind what you know about what happens when muscles go anaerobic. I'll give you a second to think about it. And so the pH should be lower. So think muscles when they go anaerobic release lactic acid. That, along with a number of other metabolic byproducts, leads to a decrease in pH in those tissues that are more highly metabolic. So then when we look at the graphs, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on because they just confuse people, these relationships become more evident if you know how to read the graphs. I just want to go over this first one right here. So what you're looking at is a graph of, on the x-axis down here, you have the partial pressure due to oxygen. So increasing oxygen availability. And on the y-axis, this is saturation of hemoglobin. So what this represents is what percentage of your hemoglobin has oxygen bound to it. And then remember, if there's oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, it's not getting out of the bloodstream into the tissues. So the higher this line goes, that means more oxygen is staying in the bloodstream and not getting into the tissue. So what we see when we look at this graph here, it's an exponential relationship. It's very steep. What that means is this encourages the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin in the lungs and encourages the release of oxygen from hemoglobin in the tissues. Let me get the pen. All right, sorry. So if you just look, let's say at, well, we'll use where the arrow is. This is partial pressure due to oxygen of 40 millimeters of mercury. So if you just read from the bottom up, this is about 75% hemoglobin saturation. What that means is about 25% of the oxygen or of the hemoglobin has let go of its oxygen. So I look at this and I see 25% delivery. And then if you go just a little bit lower, like right here, so now you're, instead of 40 millimeters of mercury, your partial pressure due to oxygen is 30 millimeters of mercury. Now you're at like 55. You're right about here on this. I can't do a straight line. Then now, what is that? If that's 55, that means you've got about 45% oxygen delivery. So if your partial pressure due to oxygen drops by 10 millimeters of mercury, you go from 25% oxygen delivery to 45% oxygen delivery. So if you are, right, if your blood going from the lungs into tissues that have less and less oxygen in them, as you travel into deoxygenated tissues, the hemoglobin starts letting go of tons of oxygen. And as blood travels from tissues into the lungs, where oxygen is more readily available, more and more oxygen piles onto the hemoglobin. Much more than would be predicted if it was a one-to-one relationship where more oxygen means more oxygen sticks to the hemoglobin. So hopefully that makes sense. If the chart just confuses you, know that if there's more oxygen around, then hemoglobin holds on more tightly to oxygen. If there's less oxygen around, hemoglobin releases the oxygen, or the affinity gets lower. So I'm not going to spend time explaining this graph here. I don't think it works very well in the screencast. And you don't really need to be able to read the graphs. So what you need to know is that as temperature increases, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is going to decrease. So if blood flows through a warmer muscle, the affinity in the warmer muscle is lower, which means hemoglobin is going to let go of the oxygen, and your warmer muscles are going to get more oxygen than your colder muscles. So your quadriceps are going to be getting more oxygen than your biceps as you're riding your bike up that hill. And then same thing with pH. Oop, looks like I cut off my title there. We already said that highly metabolic tissues tend to decrease the pH. So if you decrease the pH, as pH decreases, that is also going to decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So those tissues that have a lower pH are going to cause hemoglobin to release more oxygen as blood flows through the more highly metabolic tissues. And again, if you don't want to spend time thinking about the graphs, then don't spend time thinking about the graphs. And we'll just move on to the next slide, where things don't get any easier. So now we are talking about CO2 transport. The first thing you want to know is to just commit these numbers to memory. So 7 to 10% of your CO2 dissolves in the plasma. So that's this CO2 here. Goes from the tissues into the bloodstream and floats around in the plasma the same way CO2 floats around in your soda. 20% of it is bound by hemoglobin. So where are we? This is the 20% of the CO2 that sticks to hemoglobin and is transported as carbaminohemoglobin. And then the 70% number here is not represented on this slide. For this number, we go to the next slide, where it is the 70% of our CO2 that is converted into bicarbonate and transported in the plasma. This gets a little tricky, but is worth understanding because it affects your pH and the way your body works. So what happens when CO2 diffuses, whoops, wrong line. When CO2 diffuses into a red blood cell, there is an enzyme in the red blood cell called carbonic anhydrase. carbonic anhydrase is going to convert CO2 and water into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissolves into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Right? This is why it's an acid. So the bicarbonate gets transported out of the red blood cell and floats around dissolved in the cytoplasm as the bicarbonate ion. The hydrogen ion gets picked up by some of the hemoglobin that's letting go of oxygen. So the CO2 that gets picked up by your red blood cells and converted to bicarbonate isn't lowering the pH in your red blood cells or isn't lowering the pH of your plasma. It is simply being converted into carbonic acid, and then this bicarbonate floats around in the plasma. That bicarbonate there plays a very important role in maintaining the stable pH in your bloodstream. So it is referred to, here's your bicarbonate, but we're going to look down here first. The 70% of the CO2 that is converted to bicarbonate in your plasma is referred to as your alkaline reserve. What this means is that it acts as a base, which is going to buffer against acids or stabilize the pH, keep the pH from changing when lactic acid or some other acid is dumped into your bloodstream. And so the way it works is, if you look at this equation here, this is a double-headed arrow. All chemical reactions are theoretically reversible. When conditions are stable, they reach what is called equilibrium, where there's a set ratio of the concentration of stuff on one side of the arrow versus the concentration of stuff on the other side of the arrow. So in your bloodstream, there's always a certain amount of carbonic acid that is still intact and a certain amount of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. If everything stays the same, then the ratio of this versus that stays the same. If your body's chemistry alters the concentration of stuff on either side of the reaction, it's going to push the reaction mechanism in the opposite direction to keep those ratios in balance. So what your body has done is loaded up extra bicarbonate. So there's more bicarbonate in your bloodstream than would be predicted by the chemistry of carbonic acid. But there isn't an excess of hydrogen ions. So you end up with more bicarbonate than would normally be produced if you just stuck carbonic acid in water. So it kind of throws off the chemical equilibrium. If then your body dumps excess hydrogen ions into your bloodstream, now you've got more of this and more of that than the equilibrium would predict, and it pushes the chemistry in this direction. So if you have an excess of bicarbonate ions and more hydrogen ions shows up, the chemistry moves in this direction. So your body is loading up this side of the equation so that when acids get dumped into your bloodstream, the chemistry moves in this direction and the hydrogen ions get incorporated into this carbonic acid molecule that is not dissolved. So if we go back, this bicarbonate right here acts as a buffer and absorbs hydrogen ions that get produced by other acids that get dumped into your bloodstream. Now, we're still talking about pH. Now we need to revisit this CO2 here that gets dumped into the plasma, that is dissolved in the plasma. Some amount of this CO2 is converted into carbonic acid spontaneously in the plasma. Not a lot of it. This is a relatively slow reaction because there isn't any enzyme. There's no carbonic anhydrase in your plasma. However, because this CO2 forms carbonic acid in the plasma where there's no hemoglobin to absorb this hydrogen ion, this CO2 can affect the pH of your bloodstream. And because your respiratory system affects CO2 levels, your respiratory rate can affect your blood pH. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is that if you're breathing normally, or just a little fast or a little slow, so you're within a relatively narrow window close to your normal tidal breathing rate or volume, then your pH stays the same, and your bicarbonate buffer system helps work to keep your pH stable. Let's assume then for a second that your metabolism is fine, it is normal, everything is moving along at a steady pace, and for some reason you decide to hold your breath. So you have decreased your respiration rate, leaving all else equal. This means you're not exhaling as much CO2. Right? So you're going to get an increase in CO2 levels, which is going to cause an increase in carbonic acid buildup in the plasma. Conversely, if metabolism remains the same and for some reason you start hyperventilating, right, now you're breathing really fast, you're going to be exchanging more gas with the atmosphere, which allows more CO2 to diffuse out of your bloodstream, and your CO2 levels are going to go down, which is going to cause your carbonic acid levels to go down. This might make more sense if we look at this lovely equation again, which I know you all love. So now where are we? We're here, we're CO2, right? If you decrease your respiration rate, we already said that that is going to cause an increase in the amount of CO2 in your bloodstream. And because CO2 gets automatically converted to carbonic acid in your bloodstream, when the CO2 levels go up, your hydrogen ion concentration goes up, which means your pH is going to go, anyone? Down. So that is respiratory acidosis. If your respiratory rate declines, CO2 levels go up, pH declines, you go into respiratory acidosis. If you increase your respiration rate, now you're breathing very quickly, exchanging lots of gas with the environment. This allows for CO2 to leave your bloodstream. So now we look at this reaction mechanism here. If all things are normal, there's a certain amount of carbonic acid and a certain amount of CO2 in your bloodstream. If you change the concentration or the ratio of CO2 to carbonic acid by exhaling lots of CO2, then you're moving the chemistry in this direction. So if you have less CO2, the carbonic acid is going to fall apart to replace the CO2 you're exhaling. If your carbonic acid is being converted back into CO2, then your levels of carbonic acid are going down, which means bicarbonate and hydrogen ion are going to get back together to reform the carbonic acid to try and keep the ratio of what's here and what's here and what's here the same. So as your CO2 levels go down, your pH is going to go back up because you're reforming the carbonic acid, which is replacing the carbon dioxide, which you're breathing out. So that is how your respiratory system can alter your pH and kind of drag it out of the normal range. Then we need to consider what happens when your breathing is normal, but your metabolism changes, and then your respiratory system is going to have to change to restore proper blood pH. So in the previous slide, your changes in respiratory rate were causing acidosis and alkalosis. Now we're going to have our metabolism cause acidosis or alkalosis and see how the respiratory system is going to respond. So now we are going to assume that you're breathing fine. Your metabolism, for one reason or another, starts to acidify your bloodstream. So your body is dumping acids into your bloodstream. Your pH is going down. So if your pH is going down, that means you have an excess of hydrogen ions. You want this chemical equation here to run in this direction so that you can incorporate these hydrogen ions into carbonic acid, which then gets converted back into water. So you're going to increase your respiratory rate, which means then you're getting rid of the CO2 and pushing all the chemistry in this direction. Whoops, all the way there. If your metabolism starts alkalinizing your bloodstream for one reason or another, that causes your pH to rise. That means you don't have enough hydrogen ions. You want the chemistry to move in this direction to replace the hydrogen ions that are being neutralized by whatever bases are being dumped into your bloodstream. So now you want your respiratory rate to go down, so the CO2 builds up, and if you've got more stuff here, it pushes the chemistry in that direction. So the relationship between your respiratory rate and your blood pH is the same in both cases that we've talked about so far, respiratory acidosis and your respiratory response. What's different is what is acting first. So yeah, just take some time to mull that over. This is a complicated chapter. If you're confused, that makes sense. And hopefully you've been taking breaks, because sitting through what's going to end up being 40 minutes of the respiratory system in this relatively boring video chat style can be mind-numbing. All right, we're coming up on the end. So now we're going to talk about the control of your respiratory rate, or the two parts of your brain stem that control respiration. Your medulla, sorry I lost my pointer, your medulla and your pons, medulla and pons work together to control your respiration. We want to know what your medulla does and what your pons does. Your medulla, as it says over there, sets your basic breathing rhythm. So your normal tidal volume, respiratory rate, all of that is set by your medulla. And also you can see here, it is what innervates your respiratory muscles. So your phrenic nerve, which goes to your diaphragm, and other nerves which control respiratory muscles originate from your medulla. It also contains receptors that are going to respond to oxygen levels, pH, and CO2. Your pons, I'm not going to do the pointer, I can't find it now. There it is. Your pons then is going to influence and modify the medulla. So if you, how should I put it? If I tell you to hold your breath, or you consciously decide to breathe faster or breathe slower, that conscious motor instructions is being filtered through the pons, and it's speeding up or slowing down what's happening in the medulla. All right, last slide. So these are three chemical factors that affect your respiratory rate. It is the partial pressure due to CO2 or CO2 levels, arterial pH, and the partial pressure due to oxygen. So you want to know those three things affect your respiratory rate, and you want to know the order in which they're listed. So they're listed in the order of how influential they are. So the most powerful respiratory stimulant is rising CO2 levels. So your brain is more sensitive to CO2 levels than it is to pH as it relates to the regulation of your respiratory rate. Because CO2 affects pH, your brain also alters your respiratory rate in response to changes in pH. So pH drops, respiratory rate goes up. Oddly enough, it is the partial pressure due to oxygen that has the least influence over your respiratory rate. So what is called hypoxic drive, or the ability of low oxygen levels to stimulate an increase in respiration, is actually quite low. So your partial pressure due to oxygen has to get really low before it actually affects what your brain is doing. And we don't care about that so much, but it does become important in certain healthcare situations when you have patients on respirators and whatnot. But I will stop there. We're done 45 minutes. Congratulations on making it to the end of another screencast. Yeah, that's it. Bye.